Subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscription button below. For future webinars and online short courses, please visit our website at australianwaterschool.com.au. Welcome to this Australian Water School webinar brought to you by iSwarm. We're delighted you can join us today to discuss this critical issue of how wrong is your flood model, presented by Bill Syme and panellist Chris Huxley, both from BMT here in Australia. My name's Trevor Pillar. I'm the National Partnerships Manager here at iSwarm and the webinar chair. Look at that map of global spread of attendees to this webinar today. It's a huge number, and we're going to have a great discussion, I can just see. Well, it's obvious everyone wants to know when and where the different modelling solutions are applicable, and we are going to talk about that today. I want to give a great shout out to the team here before we start, Dr. Ian Reid, Joel Vortman, Michelle Ha, Claudio Alfaro, Danielle Cooper, Christy McCormick, and iSwarm's MD, Darryl Day. So you can see there's a ton of free webinars, online courses, and face-to-face courses covering just about anything that moves in the field of water. Go to our website, Twitter site, LinkedIn. You'll get all the details for those coming up. Well, we're right into it now, and I'm going to be handing right over to Bill and his a close colleague at BMT, Chris Huxley. I'll do a little intro. Bill and Chris both have an enormous amount of experience to bear at this webinar. Bill has over 30 years experience working on riverine, estuarine and coastal studies, most of which have been in flood hydraulics field. And Chris is principal engineer for BMT with 15 years experience with a unique mix of hydraulic modelling, software development and consulting. 20 major catchment-wide riverine and stormwater flood studies, you can see there in the blue writing. So gentlemen, so good to have you both here. Well, when I say here, where is here?
Yeah, we're in Brisbane on the east coast of Australia.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Trevor.
It's such a pleasure to have you both. Tell us exactly what's your motivation and driver for doing all this incredible years of experience? Maybe Chris, you kick off. What drives you to do this?
Personally, I just like helping people and helping the community. So it's always that big picture thing that drives me. That's why I've always worked in the flood space, and then now I'm involved in webinars, helping the greater.
Yep. I thought it might have been the numbers, a mad mathematical person.
That's how I first got into engineering. It was the mathematics, but I've evolved.
And yourself, Bill?
Much more.
No, right.
Well, I guess I've just always had a complete fascination with how water moves, and to be able to use my career to simulate how water moves around has been very rewarding. And it even helps when you're out there on a sailboard or on a whitewater kayak and paddling those rivers. I just love it. Just love the water. But also, like Chris, I really like helping people as well. So that's why I sort of gravity or towards software, because that's a big part of software, helping people out. So, I
do get that. It's a primary driver from you both over the years we've been talking back and forth over how we build a good understanding of how modelling works and behaviour of water, and the whole field it comes across clearly. Helping is what really counts here. So, all right, we'll leave it right there for the introduction. We're going to hand right over to you, Bill.
Okay, thanks, Trevor, and welcome everyone. I'm a bit overwhelmed with the numbers. Hopefully the presentation will come up to scratch. The title is How Wrong is Your Flood Model? And there's a very simple answer to that, and that is basically always. And my own personal journey, if you had to plot a graph of years of experience versus your viewpoint on how accurate a model is, well, when I started this over 30 years ago, I was pretty impressed with that you could actually even model water with a computer model. And I'm talking about a very basic 1D model back 30 years ago. None of the fancy stuff we have today. And I generally had the view that this stuff was really, really accurate. But as you get older and you lose your hair and your hair turns grayer, your viewpoint is that, well, it should be, that there's a lot of uncertainty in these models. And that's a great challenge for us, is to understand those uncertainties and convey that to others. And so the right answer today is really, is that the model should be sufficiently accurate to serve your needs, basically. Every study has different objectives, and your model needs to be sufficiently accurate to meet those objectives. And I like to think about what us modelers are all about. And to me, it's trying to be more realistic in our modeling, because ultimately what we do informs flood risk management. It feeds into the decision makers. It can affect a lot of people's lives about where they live and how they during flood evacuations, how effective they are, and ultimately can actually affect the matter of life and death. So it's all about us being as realistic as we can in our modelling. And if I chose to do another graph, look at the past through to the future, and on the left-hand axis, we're modelling the amount of uncertainties in our flood modelling or in our flood decision making. And that axis would go from very conservative approach. If you have a lot of uncertainties in your modeling, you need to be very conservative in your decision makings. For example, you might have a larger freeboard if you have a lot of uncertainties in your flood modeling. But if your flood modeling is more and more accurate, then it allows the decision makers to be less conservative and be more precise about their advice to the community. And the really good news is that we've due to the advance of computers, the amazing data collection techniques we have today, as well as advances in software, we've been becoming increasingly more and more realistic in our modeling. And that actually then feeds back to our modeling being more accurate. So while the previous graph would imply that, I think my viewpoint is that models, as you get older, you get less and less accurate, but actually with the amazing data collection we're having today and the speed of computers and also our software, we are heading down towards a more and more realistic path, which means that hopefully we can be less conservative in our decision making when it comes to floods. So we'll never quite reach the realistic thing. No model will ever be fully realistic, but we're heading that way, which is great. And why do we have these uncertainties when we're trying to model a flood? Well, it's just complicated. It's not that simple to model a flood. You've got uncertainties in your ground topography data. It could be land use, soil types. If you're feeding those in, how accurate is that data? And dams and structures, do you have those surveyed properly? Do you have the crest levees or survey of a levee bank surveyed well? It goes on and on and on. Your conditions, whether they're dry or wet, and how are you representing those? And a big one, is, of course, is rainfall variability. That's a highly probable one as to how your rain actually falls on the ground. And the list can go on and on and on. And so when it comes to uncertainties in your data, I'm actually only going to say one thing, and that's basically garbage in, garbage out. And it's really important that you understand that the information you're feeding into your model is going to have an impact on the information coming out. So you do have to appreciate that if you're doing if the objective of your modeling is to do a very rough first pass, where does the floodwaters potentially go? Of course, you can have less accurate data. But if you're providing advice to councils or to government on planning processes and so forth, well, then it's really important that you're dealing with a much more accurate data set. So the accuracy of that data will affect your accuracy of your modeling. The other side of the coin is, in terms of the complications of modeling a flood, is your actual modeling. And that's, that will always be a challenge. And there's effectively 3 stages in the process. One is you need to convert your rainfall to runoff, and that's what we would call hydrologic modeling. And that's always very, very challenging because you often don't know how your rain fell and so forth. And it's a very, very complex physical process that you're trying to reproduce with a computer model. Then you have to simulate the flood wave, which is what we call hydraulics. Now that's sort of based a bit more on more precise physics, if you like. We actually use the fluid flow equations to simulate the flood wave, but there's various forms of that as I'll be discussing. And then there's the final stage of estimating your design flow, and that's somewhat comes down to statistics. How do we come up with the 1 in 100 event, and how accurate can we be, or how confident can we be that it is representative of the 1 in 100? So today I'm going to focus on, not the hydrology, but I'm going to focus on simulating the flood wave and talk about two topics. And that is the suitability of your hydraulic solver. Is it fit for purpose? And the importance of calibration, reducing parameter uncertainty. That's what calibration does. It gives you a lot more confidence about your parameters that you feed into your model, such as Manning's N. And the second topic or second area I'm going to discuss is estimating your design floods. And that's really down to statistics. And that's often a space that I struggle with, because statistics was always something that I found I much prefer a differential equation to the dark art of statistics. But anyway, it's been some interesting things happening in Australia, which I would like to pass on. I'll just run through these three top points here on the screen over the next 20 minutes or so. So simulating the flood wave. So the question here is, what is important for a flood wave? And on the screen there, you can see the form of the 2D momentum equation, which really controls how the water moves around in your model if you're using a sort of 2D horizontal plane. And what we're about here is trying to work out how the velocity changes over time. And all these things in all the boxes here are the sorts of things that can affect how that water moves around. So obviously, if the water has inertia, it'll sort of keep going. If it, it's sort of water will run up a hill if it has inertia behind it. Coriolis force is the rotation of the Earth. Gravity, of course, water's going to move downhill. And resisting that flow will be bed resistance. So that's typically your Manning's equation or your Chesney equation. There's the eddy viscosity term, or subgrid scale turbulence, and that's to do with the water shearing on itself. So if there's a lot of complex flows, that actually will make lose energy effectively. Atmospheric pressure and external forces. So atmospheric pressure is really where you've got a cyclone or hurricane. And external forces are things like wind and wave radiation stresses. So in the coastal world, you pretty well need all of those terms. But in the flood world, you can pretty well not bother with Coriolis. That's not needed. It has no effect on a flood wave. And atmospheric pressure doesn't come into the play either. Occasionally, you might need an external force like a wind, but that's pretty rare. The sort of terms you do need are gravity, otherwise the water won't move downhill. You need bed resistance. That whether you've got a nice smooth road or a very dense forest, the water's going to be more resistive in that forest scenario. So you definitely need bed resistance. Inertia will be needed at times, particularly where your flow is going around bends and so forth, and similarly for turbulence or eddy viscosity. So just to try and picture that for people, on the right-hand side of the screen here, there's two photos taken from the 1990 flood in Newcastle, Australia. And both photos are taken in close proximity to each other. And the top photo there is basically, away from the main flow path, if you like. It's, low velocities, the water's hardly moving. You've got a guy just cycling through the flood waters there. Flat gradients, no dynamic energy head to be lost. And, effectively subcritical flow. These backward areas often can be quite large, so their storage or their volume can be very important into how a flood moves down a floodplain. But it's quite a benign sort of scenario. Whereas the bottom image actually is showing, supercritical flow, a hydraulic jump back to subcritical. You get an idea of how fast the water is moving by that big spout of water against the bridge deck there. And so you're talking about sort of much steeper gradients, complex flow patterns, potential for lots of high energy losses. You may have a hydraulic jump such as that one there. And you have a mix of super and subcritical flow. But typically most floods are operating at a subcritical flow regime. So in terms of the equation I showed earlier, what's important and what's not. So for that top image, you would definitely need gravity, bed resistance, so where the water is moving. But if you didn't have the inertia term in your solution, and you didn't have your turbulence or eddy viscosity, it wouldn't make any difference, because basically the bed resistance dominates. these inertia and eddy viscosity, just, those terms will be very, very small because there's no variation of velocity within space. The bottom one, however, is a different story. You definitely still need gravity and bed resistance. But you wouldn't be able to solve the flow in that sort of complex flow environment if you didn't have inertia, and also if you didn't have a representation for subgrid scale turbulence. So what you need is very dependent on the flow regimes that you're experiencing. And how we can sort of demonstrate that through some benchmarking. So this is actually a flow against a building benchmark Flume model out of Belgium some years ago. And they let a pool of water out to the left here and released it, and a hydraulic jump forms in front of the building and then slowly propagates upstream as the waters subside. And they measured this all over the place. And I'd like to show this next image. I've had this shown this many times now, and I actually asked the audience which result is least wrong. And it's always very interesting in the reply. Effectively, the bottom one is, the top one is more correct than the bottom one. And the difference between these two animations is the top one has the eddy viscosity term in it and the bottom one it doesn't. And you can see here that the hydraulic jump line in the bottom one is way further downstream than up here. And that's because there's no subgrid scale turbulence being computed. Therefore, the flow is much more fluid. It's simulating something that's not water, basically. And so you get quite a different positioning of this hydraulic jump. And we know that through by comparison with the actual measurements. So if you just look at the two gauges that they had to monitor the position of that hydraulic jump, 1 and 2, and we compare the results, we have here the top graph is water level, the bottom graph is velocity, and the light blue shadings is the measured values. The green line is with eddy viscosity in the equations turned on. So you can see here it's giving a better, it's still not perfect of course, but it's giving a better representation that of gauge 1 over here than the case, the red line, which is without eddy viscosity. If you move to location 2, it's a bit more pronounced. So basically, location 2, the hydraulic jump never passed through the case with no eddy viscosity. This has just remained in supercritical flow the whole way through. So this is the water level without viscosity. Whereas the case with viscosity picks up that jump reasonably nicely and certainly follows the measurements nicely through the back end here. And same with the velocity at location 2. Obviously a lot of variation because it's incredibly turbulent, complex flow. But you just need that little bit of eddy viscosity to make the numerical model reproduce reality or reproduce what was measured in this Flume test. So you do need these more sophisticated terms at times, and it'll mainly be where you have very complex flows, fast flowing rivers, structures, and so forth. The other moral here, of course, is just be very aware of the cool animation. I think we all like the bottom animation more than the top one, but it wouldn't be the one that you would want to run with. So, you really have to decide as modelers, are the mathematics in your software appropriate? And I'll just show a nice little example here. This came out of the States some years ago. We didn't do this modeling, but they were simulating a levee breach onto a floodplain, and this is just showing the rise in water level over time as that flood wave from the breach went across the floodplain. Very long durations down the bottom here. And when they first did this study, they used one piece of software, but they had some concerns about the results. There was a very slow travel time. The peak was occurring way after the actual breach. And so they weren't very comfortable with the results they were getting. So they then tried it with another bit of software, identical data, identical models, and they got a very different result. And then, that was a bit confusing, or they really wanted to, be a bit more confident about how realistic their modeling was. And then they ran it with another third software, and they got, in fact, almost too similar. The software B and software C gave very, very similar results. So that sort of gave them some, I guess, more confidence that software B and software C are doing the right thing, or more closer to reality than software A. What's interesting is the software A was effectively just a simple 1D solver over a 2D grid, whereas software B and C were advanced second order solvers. And so, you know, it's a good illustration that, you know, sometimes a bit of software may be able to produce nice images and nice maps, but it may not be appropriate for your solution, as was the case here with software A. So you do have to ensure your hydraulic solver is appropriate for your application. And it's quite easy for me to say that, but I can strongly sort of recommend to people that if you have doubts, you should, you know, maybe benchmark against other software as these people did, or you go seek advice. You know, talk to people. It's really, really worthwhile doing that, just to make sure that you have a bit of a comfort zone. So that's it for that suitability of hydraulic solver topic. I'm now going to chat about the importance of calibration, and that's all about reducing the uncertainty in your parameters such as Manning's ends and bend losses and so forth.
Is this a good moment then, Bill, to just take a couple of questions? Daniel Alfonso has asked, what's an appropriate viscosity value for modelling the embankment dam breach? You might see that on your Q&A screen, Bill.
That's an extremely good question. And actually it's an area of research that we're working on at the moment. Well, for starters, not the kinematic viscosity value. This is to do with eddy viscosity or the shearing of water on itself. You know, basically what the turbulence is happening at this below the 2D cell size. Generally speaking, the default values used by the coastal systems such as Tuflo and others. They've used the Smagorinsky formula, and that's generally served us very well. There's an issue which relates to as your depth gets much bigger than your cell size, and we're seeing this more and more with our very fine grid models, that the eddy viscosity formulation needs to be improved. And we're actually presenting a paper at the end of the year in New Zealand on this very topic, and it's it's a very, very interesting space. But for most models to date, you can generally run with the defaults with reasonable confidence. But as your depth gets greater than your cell size, there is certainly a strong indication that we need to improve how we're doing that. And one of my guys who's got a CFD background has been investigating various alternative ways of dealing with eddy viscosity so that there's not a mesh size dependency. And so watch that space. If you contact us later in the year, we'll hopefully be able to help you out.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Thanks, Daniel, from Bogota in Colombia. That's really good. Another one.
Can I just add to that as well?
Sorry, go on, Chris. Yep, sorry.
Just to add to that a little bit more, it's almost worth mentioning that there's a lot of different schemes out there. So there's a question there, what exact parameter or value should I use? That will obviously depend on whether you're using, say, a constant approach versus Smagorinsky versus K epsilon, K omega. The coefficients that you would apply for each are very different.
Yeah, good point, Chris.
It's not a simple answer as the value is 0.5.
Yep, well said. So the next one's from Mode. Yes, that exactly happened. In high stream flow, the model didn't work. So what should be the solution during high stream flow?
It would very much depend on the software or the solution, as Chris was saying, but we'd have to see more details to actually answer that one. So.
Right, so I'll come to that. Thanks a lot for that question anyway. Is there a rule of thumb on what would classify as high versus low velocity?
Yeah, I guess once your Froude number starts to get, I mean, it's more to do with the change in topography, to be honest, because you can have uniform flow down a straight line channel, traveling at very high velocities, and if that channel just continues with no obstruction or no bend, the eddy viscosity term and also the inertia term, they really don't change because there's no change in your velocity spatially. It's when you actually expand the water or you contract the water or you go around the bend, you're forcing that water to go in a different direction to what it wants, that these terms really kick in. So but most cases in the flood world that water doesn't remain nice and straight. It'll hit bends and structures and it'll expand and contract, and whenever that's happening is when you want to have these more sophisticated terms being solved well.
Well, I think we might leave it at that for the time being. So if you press on for the next session, that will give. There's a few more questions there, but we'll take them a bit later. Thank you everyone for your questions. That's really good.
So on to calibration. So on the screen here, you can see a hydrograph from the Brisbane River study actually, and this is at one of the upstream gauges. That was a pretty important point for calibration. And the blue line was what was recorded in one of the major floods here in Brisbane. And that's actually, so that's the recorded hydrograph. You can see the tide at the beginning here. And then as the flood comes through, it sort of peaks. And then what's quite interesting with the Brisbane River study is that in most of the floods, there's a period of steady state release from the flood control dam upstream. So you effectively have for 2 or 3 days, a period of pretty well constant flow. So it's like a real world steady state model, which is a bit unusual to find. So, this is one of the gauges that we were calibrating to. The process we took was to first calibrate the tidal areas, and we came out with this. This is very common for us to come up with a Manning's N of 0.022. 0.02 to 0.025 generally gives you a very nice tidal signal. So we're very comfortable with that value as being a good in-bank Manning's N parameter. We then calibrated to sort of a few minor floods and the post-flood steady-state release, and we found that we needed Manning's Ns of about 0.031 to 0.038 instead of the 0.022 to get a reasonable calibration to the peaks of the minor floods and to the steady-state release. But you can see here that at the peak of the major flood, it is still under-predicting. And so to get a calibration to the peak of the major flood, which is the orange line, we needed a Manning's N of 0.041. So basically, the bigger the flow, the higher the flow, the higher the Manning's N that was required to calibrate at this gauge. And the other thing you might notice is that the timing of the orange and the green lines is actually out. It's about 6 hours earlier than the actual recorded peak. So, that's of concern as well. It's not a big difference, but it's sort of, it's an indication that something's not 100%. Anyway, the interesting thing is if you ran with, if we didn't have any other data and we just set our model Manning's N to 0.038 or 0.041, somewhere around there, you'd be sort of reasonably okay at that upstream gauge in terms of the peak. But in reality, you would be terribly wrong. And how do we know that? Well, there's a heap of data between the upstream gauge that I just showed before and down at the ocean. And I've just zoomed into a very tiny part of this. And this is sort of the main city of Brisbane. And so the green line is the 0.038, the profile, peak profile for that major flood. And the orange line is 0.041. So it's just a little bit higher, as you would expect. These black lines here are the bridge decks of some of the major bridges. You'd actually, based on these simulations, the floodwaters will be actually hitting and going over this bridge deck here. And in reality, what was recorded there were there's some other gauges, such as these purple lines. So there are other gauges, and they are only peaking at those levels there. The green dots are peak flood levels within 100 meters of the stream center line, and the light blue dots are within 500 meters. So some of those will be out in the floodplain. And you can see that the Manning's N of 0.038 and 0.041 are grossly wrong, predicting flood levels more than 2 meters too high through the main city area. So while the upstream gauge might be okay, the actual reality is that those Manning's Ns were completely inappropriate for reproducing the flood down through the city. We then sort of revised our sort of approach to how we went about this calibration, and we switched to an approach of adopting that tidal Manning's N of 0.022 and then applying bend losses. There's about 20 quite strong bends in the Brisbane River system, so there's a lot of energy lost at those bends. And so those, each bend we applied a bend loss, and we used a 0.022 Manning's N instead of the 0.038 or 0.041. And that's, yeah, so how do we go at the upstream gauge? Well, you can see here that the 0.022 plus bend losses actually gives it, which is the red dash line, gives a very nice reproduction of the flood peak, very nice sort of shape. And the tide is good because of the 0.022, and bend losses are very small because the tidal velocities are very low. Getting a very good match during the steady state release at the end of after the flood. And we are getting a much better timing of the peak. That was a very interesting outcome. So the timing of the peak is pretty well on the money. So we're very pleased with that sort of calibration. But what was more important was that this one set of parameters, 0.022 plus the bend losses, allowed us to achieve a calibration for a tide, 3 minor floods, 2 major floods, and during post-dam releases. So there's a one set of parameters applied throughout the entire range of calibration events. Whereas just using Manning's N, we're looking at having different Manning's N values, not as good a calibration. And suddenly Manning's N becomes a function of flood size, which is an issue for other reasons. So yeah, it was a big tick. We are very pleased with how that came about. But it does really show the importance of calibration. And also of interest is that those previous slides were from a 1D only model. So what about 2D? So this study also developed a 2D model. When we ran the 2D model out of the 0.038 or 0.041, and we just sort of did this out of interest, upstream gauge was terrible. We were way, way too high. And the reason for that is that the 2D equations actually will simulate the majority of your bend losses because they actually take that energy loss due to water changing direction around the bend into account, whereas a 1D model doesn't. Hence why you need to apply bend losses to a 1D model. Yeah, and you can see that in the results here. So this is some of the 2D results. You can see the water level contours much tighter around the bend. You know, they're 0.1 meter increments, whereas in the straight sections, you can see here that there's big gaps between the contours. So the water's, you know, a much flatter gradient through the straight sections and a very steep gradient around the bend. You can also see the super elevation. And you know, this bend, for example, there's about 0.6.7 of a meter difference in water level from one side of the river to the other, which is recorded. And also that came out in the modeling, as with other bends. So yeah, very interesting exercise. And what was sort of fascinating at the end was, and then once again highlighting the need for calibration, was that we could get a good 2D calibration using the same Manning's N as we have for the 1D model of 0.022, and using about 20% of the 1D bend losses. You have to remember that 2D is not 3D. It won't simulate all the energy losses. There's some strong circular flows in this bend. And it's, yes, but the 2D will simulate a large percentage of those losses. So for those interested, you know, typical bend losses values that we use, so your 180-degree bends like this one here typically had a bend loss of around 1.5 in the 1D model and about 0.3 in the 2D model. And 90-degree bends were roughly half that. So it all sort of stacked up, and it was well supported by an absolute staggering amount of calibration data. So very, very interesting exercise. So in terms of calibration, the lessons to be learned are that you know, if you can calibrate a model, particularly if you've got really good calibration data, not just one point, you've got a range of points throughout your system and a range of size events, it substantially reduces the uncertainty in those parameters. And that gives you a lot more confidence about your modeling. And it also, you know, it means your modeling is much closer to reality. So when you're doing that community consultation and so forth, you're on a much stronger foothold. Obviously, you need data. I can't stress enough about the need for historic flood data of all shapes and forms. And I think it's one thing I've felt a bit sad about in recent years is that, you know, we have these floods and we just don't collect the amount of data we used to sometimes. And I think that's a real shame because you only have one opportunity sometimes to get these great data sets. Interesting observation from that Brisbane River study is that, yeah, 2D equations, as we expect, do simulate energy losses in the horizontal plane. So, you know, losses around bends, the 2D will cover that, but you know, if you're applying a 2D bend loss, you will need something significantly lower than the 1D bend losses. And a really good tip is, you know, we were feeling very uncomfortable about those Manning's Ns of 0.038 and 0.041, and that's primarily because they were not what we would normally apply for a river of that type. You know, typically you would have a Manning's N of 0.0 to 2 up to maybe 0.03 at the most. And so if your Manning's end values are not within your expectations, then something else is wrong. So you have to go digging. So that's all I had on importance of calibration. I'm not sure, Trevor, did you want to stop there?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, do you think we could take a moment's break? Also, Chris, could you join us? There's a number of questions coming up here that are going to be important, I reckon. That's an interesting graph out by 2 meters using N tidal value earlier, that red line showing up to 2 meters difference. Just incredible that the Manning's values changed. That was a fantastic graph. Look, let's go to these questions. How did you apply the first one there, MD Mustafizer? How did you apply 0.022 bend losses? That's the one I was just mentioning just then.
Well, plus bend losses, because they're separate to the Manning's end.
Yeah, so they're separate inputs. So the 0.022 is your Manning's end value, and you know, the channel or the 2D area there where you had the bend loss where you wanted to apply that, you just applied that as a value, say for example 1, and basically what would happen is you'd lose 1 dynamic head around that bend if you put a value of 1 in. So that's the dynamic head being v squared on 2g.
So in TUFO, that's applied as a form loss. In the 1D, there's also a separate option where you can apply that too.
It's great. Another one here, then we'll perhaps keep going. Thank you for that. Anonymous, with regards to the model calibration, how do you ensure that we aren't just curve fitting by adjusting input parameters? How do you know which parameters to adjust?
Yeah, good. Well, I mean, the primary ones, of course, typically you fine tune. You often have a good idea with something like Manning's end, but would be Manning's end. If you do have sharp bends, high velocities, or if you have a structure where you're getting a lot of, you know, that business of flow expanding is where you tend to lose most of your energy. Then you need to apply energy losses. In a 1D system, you use that with your, for example, your inlet outlet losses on a structure. In a 2D system, it will actually simulate some of those. So you may have to, if you apply any energy losses or form losses, as Chris just said, you would have to be a bit conscious about the values that you're using. The other parameter I think we will increasingly look more closely at is the one I talked about before, is the subgrid scale turbulence value. I think we're learning a lot about that at the moment, particularly as these models become very fine cell sizes.
Can I just add to that? It's also very important that you calibrate to multiple events of different magnitude. I've come across a few studies where they applied a unique Manning's end value for the river, depending on the size of the event. And I actually see that as an indicator there's something else wrong in the model. So you should be able to actually have a model that can run for the full suite of floods, you know, from a tidal simulation up to quite a large magnitude flood where most of the flooding's in the floodplain, using one input model, I guess. You're just changing the boundary conditions.
One last one. Now let's go with Andrew Brown from WA, Knight Peasold in Western Australia. Are there any comments about using a curve of Manning's N versus flow depth instead of a single value for all depths?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of merit in that. Once again, we don't have a lot of good data. Certainly there's been evidence of, particularly where there's been a flattening of the vegetation, or a stripping of the vegetation, that obviously your Manning's end value would change during the course of the flood. There's also, in the direct rainfall or rain on grid modeling space in urban areas, varying your Manning's end with height at very, very shallow depths has been sort of used as a calibration or parameter, or a way of representing that very thin flow during the when model is, you know, just getting a tiny bit of water on top of it. But you know, once again, it comes back down to being able to demonstrate your parameters that you're using, whether it's a single N or it's N varying with depth, reproduces reality. And that's where, as Chris said before, you need a range of historic flood events, and you need data collected from those events. And you need confidence in your hydrology as well. We're a bit lucky with the Brisbane River study. They measured the flows on 2 of those major floods and another flood in the city. So there's very little doubt about the actual flow coming into the hydraulic models for those historic events. So often your hydrology, which I'm not talking about today, is a major part of the problem, because there's a lot of uncertainty about how your rain fell and how you're modelling that process.
There was a bit more to that question, Chris. You may have seen that also. Andrew said, to clarify my query, it's related to 2D models, essentially going with very high N values greater than 0.1 for very shallow depths and rapidly dropping down and stabilizing to a river value, say 0.03-ish. Does that throw any more light into this question, or did you cover that all right?
I think Bill covered that okay. Yeah.
Okay, yep, that's fine. Thank you, Andrew. That was a great question. One last one then before we press on. But Helen Fairweather asks, have you used Lagrangian data from drifters for calibration?
No, not personally, no.
No, me either.
Helen, thanks very much for your question. And we'll hand right back to you, Bill.
So, estimating design floods, and for those who work in Australia, you'll be familiar with some of this, and those outside Australia, it'd be interesting to hear what you think. So, Australia has a book, if you like, or a guide called Australian Rainfall and Runoff, and this first edition came out in 1958. It's very, very simple. Obviously, no fancy computers back then, and it just allowed engineers to come up with a peak flow or maybe a unit hydrograph. In 1977, they moved to a more sophisticated approach where they tried to get away from the unit hydrograph approach and actually have a temporal pattern for your rainfall that more closer to reality, if you like. And 87 was similar, but much more, based on a lot more data and more research and more thorough. And so those two editions of this document, they tried to transition to a more realistic representation of how the rain fell on the ground. 2016 is the most recent one. That's been a major shift because we recognize that there's a lot of uncertainty about how the rain falls on the ground. Like you have a front-loaded storm, you could have a rear-loaded storm. Your storm might not be, it might be fairly evenly distributed. So they've moved to an approach where each duration has 10 temporal patterns for each AEP. And so you're basically modeling 10 different events, and then you're taking the average or the median. So this has been a big shift from where we were here to this new approach. And it's like what we call a semi-Monte Carlo style approach. And that would be like the holy grail, if you like, if you can move into the Monte Carlo space, but that's still some way off probably. It's a dream of some. Effectively, in the full Monte Carlo, you're doing thousands and thousands of simulations, and you're varying your temporal pattern, your rainfall, you're varying your wet and dry conditions before the flood. If you've got dams, you would vary how full those dams are before the flood comes through. But this journey that Australian Rainfall and Runoff has been on is quite interesting, and it's all about reducing the uncertainty and deriving a whole heap of things, but this reducing uncertainty in our design floods is a big part of it. And basically be trying to get our design floods closer to reality, because often they're not. If you just use a unit hydrograph approach, you're well removed from reality. Another way of looking at it is one of our preeminent hydrologists here sees it as the evolution of Hydroman. So he reckons we're about here now. So this is his goal, is to make it to this point here. How does it work? Well, so in 87, we just had these temporal patterns, one temporal pattern per duration per region. In 2016, we have moved to a few more regions, and we've also recognized that how a rain falls for a major flood might be quite different to how rain falls for a minor flood. So they've got 4 AEP bands, and then for each region, for each AEP band, for each duration, there's 24 durations. There are 10 temporal patterns. And those temporal patterns have been sourced for hundreds of thousands of recorded storm bursts. As I said before, they haven't just selected those at random. They've sorted them intelligently. So you have some front-loaded storms in your 10, you have some rear-loaded storms in your 10, and you have some flat ones. So you end up with a sort of range, a representative range of the typical storm patterns that have been recorded for those various regions. And how does it work in reality, or what are some of the observations that we've had from applying this new approach? So one thing is that the 2016 ANR is tending to produce lower design floods. I mean, this is a general comment. There might be situations where that's not the case. And so on the right there, we have the flow hydrographs from at a location. This is what we would have got with the 1987 temporal pattern for that region, that location for this AEP. The other lines are the 10 temporal patterns that we've simulated using the new ARNR. So you can see them all over the place. And we don't take the maximum of those, we take the average or median of those 10 temporal patterns. And so this is going to be the new design flow for using the 2016 ARNR. So you can see it's come down from the 87 one. And that's really because the 87 temporal patterns were very much trying to lump together, it's a little bit like some of the unit hydrograph methods do, something representative for the all the types of patterns they've seen. But in 2016, we're actually just taking real temporal patterns from the huge database we have. This lowering of design floods, I will just sort of add in here one comment that was given to me by some practitioners, was it's been very, very convenient. It's sort of acting as a very nice buffer for climate change. So you won't necessarily see a council lower the flood level for their planning levels. They'll actually then do their climate change assessments and they'll find that they're coming back up here, but at least they're not having to raise their flood levels higher. So that's sort of been a nice sort of convenient outcome of ARNR 2016. There's some other interesting benefits too, is that your temporal patterns, just having this range of 10 gives you some idea of the uncertainty or range in your 1 in 100 levels that you get. Because any of these floods, all these 10 floods have exactly the same 1 in 100 year total rainfall. They just have different temporal patterns about how the rain falls. Some other metrics are being proving very useful. For example, this flood here, it may not be the median or may come in lower than the median, but it actually gives you a bit of an idea of what could happen in terms of warning times and flood evacuation needs. So you're getting other metrics from this range of 10 that sort of help inform your flood risk management. And once again, making our ability to make decisions much more informed, if you like. So while ARNR 2016 is, I guess, is a bit more of a greater cost to implement, it is also, we're seeing it as much more realistic. It's much easier for the community to swallow, and therefore it's much more defendable. I'm just going to have a few slides to finish off on the Monte Carlo statistical approach. So what we're seeing before there with ARNR 2016 is really a very, like a cut down Monte Carlo style approach that is feasible to do with our current computing speeds. When you move into the full-blown Monte Carlo approach, you're literally simulating thousands and thousands of events. And you can see there's a whole pile of events here that were simulated at one of many locations on the Brisbane River study. And the problem with the Brisbane River is that that previous approach of ARNR 2016 really doesn't apply, because while it may cover rainfall temporal pattern variation, it doesn't take into account the dryness of the catchment, the joint probability of different systems coming in. It's a very big system, the Brisbane River. Doesn't take into account if one of these dams is very low or whether it's very full. And so there's these other variations that we need to account for. And just to give you an idea, so for example, all these events here all had the same total 1 in 100 rainfall. But one of them would have had a spatial variation like that. And this event here might have had a different spatial variation. So all these events are handling in the way that the rain falls. Does it come from the east? Does it come from the south? Does it come from the west? And they've used historical data to come up with that variability and sample it. The other critical thing for this study was the conditions prior to the flood. So if you have a wet catchment and your dams are near full, you'll obviously get a higher flood level than if you have a dry catchment and the dams are near empty, such as down in here. So all these events here and across the whole spectrum here are basically sampling the variability that can occur due to all the things I've just been talking about. And that gives you a much better handle as to where, what your sort of 1 in 100, 1 in 20, 1 in 50 type flood event is. So we end up with, the people who do these sort of analysis, actually, they analyze all these values and they effectively come up with a line, I wouldn't say down the middle, but they have a special technique for statistically analyzing these results. And from that, you can then much more confidently derive that your 1 in 100 level at this site is going to be around 40 meters. So, but we're picking up all the variability by doing this Monte Carlo approach. And what was very clear to me, sort of project managing this study and being a bit of an onlooker to this side of things, was that the uncertainties associated with the huge variability you can have with these larger catchments in rainfall, both spatially and temporally, with antecedent conditions, the storage buffer in the dams, whether the dam is dry, low down, or very full prior to flood, has a big impact on the flood levels. And also the ocean storm tide was also varied for every one of the thousands and thousands of simulations that were carried out. So the uncertainties were greatly reduced, and that allowed us much more confidently to come up with your 1 in 100 and other AEP flood levels. So just to wrap up, I'm nearly out of time here. So, how wrong is your flood model? Well, as I said earlier, it's always wrong. So what do we do? What we need to do as modelers, we need to understand and reduce the uncertainties where needed, and if needed. You may well be, you've got a great data set and you've got a great bit of software and you've got a great calibration data set and you're on a good space, but often we're not in that space. So we have to decide, is our model fit for purpose? Is your data going in okay compared to your data if you put garbage in, you'll get garbage out. So make sure that the data is appropriate for the level of accuracy modeling that you're been asked to do. Make sure your mathematics is appropriate. Sometimes the more simple schemes are fine in more benign flows, but if you have any major complex flows, fast flowing areas, you will definitely need to be using those more higher level sophisticated solvers. And of course, beware of the cool animation. They can be very misleading. They look good, but they can be misleading. Calibration, I just can't stress the huge benefits from calibrating models. It really does just allow you to prove and demonstrate your model can reproduce reality. Very, very important. And it'll also help highlight if there's deficiencies in the data set and so forth. And with regard to design flood estimation, I think it's a pretty exciting space. As computers get faster and faster, as we push more and more simulations, or have the ability to simulate thousands of simulations across the cloud, I can see the Monte Carlo style approach, or the semi-Monte Carlo approach, is adopted in Australia recently as becoming more the mainstream. And that's going to give us a lot more confidence on, and less uncertainty around our design flood estimation. So that's pretty well all I wanted to say. So thank you from me on that. And we can probably
Fantastic.
more questions, maybe.
Yep, there is a time. We will make time. It's just such an interesting discussion going on here. Chris, join us, please. And I would like to just make a point here that Chris Huxley will be presenting at the course this year, at the end of this year, Tuesday 12th, Tuesday 19th of November. We'd love you to join us and Chris the same. If you want to know more, my colleague Chrissy has just put up the registration web link for that course in flood modelling coming up in November. We'd love you to be there. So let's just do two things. There's an enormous number of questions, and Chris has been madly responding to most of them. Thanks so much, Chris. And look, let's try for Owen. If you're there, we'll take an on-screen response. Where are you from, Owen?
I'm from Sydney.
Sydney, yep, far away.
Yeah, I just got a question about the two flow and the big flood in Brisbane in 2011.
Yep.
I want to check what's the difference for the latest version about the two flow and the old version in 2011. So how we can apply the new version to help the local councils to mitigate the flood issues in the future.
How do you mean which version, Owen?
For example, in 2011, that's a big flood in Brisbane. I'm not sure what's BCC used. What kinds of software are they using at that time to simulate the flooding?
Yeah, so two flow was used for that Brisbane River flood study, which was one that, and I was actually the project manager for that study.
So I think what Owen's getting at is if the modelling was done in 2011, and subsequent to that, there's been a number of changes in the software. So, for example, we're in 2019 now. How does a council rationale or accommodate for those changes? Do you always just move up to the latest release, or do you...
So I mean that study was done using TwoFlow, what we call TwoFlow Classic, and so that TwoFlow Classic hasn't changed since then. So you effectively get the same numbers now. Of course, we have our new GPU-based HPC solver, which is same equations but different way of solving them. And the numbers that come out when you run that model are different, but they're not grossly different. They're quite similar given the size of the system. So if you wanted to move that model to two-flow HPC, for example, you'd have to go through a process of just fine-tuning the calibration. So what you might see is slightly different. You probably have the same Manning's N value, but you might have some slightly different N losses at various locations. And actually the eddy viscosity representation HPC is being improved as well. So I think that's going to be quite interesting to see how that goes. But it does demonstrate the need for calibration, no matter how good your software is. If you really want to bed down some solid parameters, it's good to have that calibration. But your parameters should always be in the right ballpark. And as we would see, whether you use two-flow classic or two-flow HPC for that study.
Can I just add to that, Bill? So obviously, as you know, 2011 was a while ago, and the science is always evolving. So with each release, things do change, and you can get slight changes in water level as a result. From the planning side of things, if a council sets planning levels using a certain version of two-flow, they want certainty that they get the exact same level. Two-flow does have backward compatibility. So every time we do a release, we'll include a command that relates back to past releases. So even though you'd be using the 2017 release, you could say, I can't remember what the command is, but backward compatibility to 2011, it would revert back all those defaults to the 2011 defaults. Still worth checking you do get the right answer in case we miss something. But
yeah. And actually, one interesting thing on that Brisbane River study, so the HPC solver used to be a simple first order. Its first incarnation was a simple first order solution. It's now second order, the same as classic. But when you run that model through the first order solution, you get much higher flood levels. You have to really pull your Manning's Ns down. It's a good example. I didn't talk about it today, but that is a good example where a first order solver does tend to over predict the energy losses through a system. It doesn't converge as well. And so that was an interesting observation. That was actually one of the main drivers we wanted to convert that old solver to a second order solution, which has become two-flow HPC, because ones like the Brisbane River just wasn't cutting it, the old first order approach.
That's great. Thank you, Owen. That's a terrific question. We'll take one last comment here from Gang Fu. I think it's a comment. If floodplain is dominated by small channels and shallow sheet flow, Manning's N should be increased as the recommended values were obtained in a fully rough, turbulent channel flow setting.
The modeler should always, it's their decision what Manning's N you use. I'm not sure why you would say.
Might be asking, should Manning's N, Gang Fu might be asking, should Manning's N be increased as the recommended values obtained in a fully, well, let's leave it then. Yeah. You can, clarify that. No, that's fine. And Andrew's comment there. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Andrew Brown. Thanks, Chris. I'll give that paper a read. Actually developed a curve using equations from that website there. I think.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. I'll check that one out. I'll quickly copy that before we.
This is what these forums are all about. I appreciate your comments, Andrew, and everybody else. Santosh, great. David White, Reese. There's a whole lot more. Corbett. It goes. Too much for us to do in 1 hour. We're going to have to call it quits, I feel. Gentlemen, it's been an absolutely brilliant hour, and it's an incredible amount of work been done here. Christopher Power says, great webinar, guys. Thanks to all from Cock 10 Can. Gang Fu, superb presentation. Thank you. We really appreciate it, gentlemen, for all your work you've done. You can see there on the screen now. Thanks for participating. Feedback, short survey will come to you as close the window. We'll send you the recording link, and do check our website and Twitter and YouTube channels, and you'll see all the webinars we've done and the webinars coming up and the other online courses we're doing next. Once again, a fantastic hour. I really appreciate your time, Bill, Chris, and I'm looking forward to the course up in November. Everyone, it's on the chat line, the registration point. And I can see now from the chat line coming through tons of thank yous, an outstanding presentation from Tyrone, Aaron, many, many more. I won't read them all out. It's been a great hour. Anything final to say, Bill, Chris? What would you do if this was your last moment to talk about flood modelling?
Oh, not sure. I'll probably go get a beer, I think.
Good comment.
I'll join you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks for dialing in. Yeah, it's very good. Thanks.
Been great. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Bill, and all the team here, Christy. See you again next time.
Subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscription button. For future webinars and online short courses, please visit our website at australianwaterschool.com.au.